The following show is brought to you in partnership with the Institute of Politics, Policy, and History, Blue Star Strategies, Bright Road Incorporated, Make It Plain Podcast, and RPC Media.
From the campus of the University of the District of Columbia, this is State of Play.
Welcome to State of Play. I'm Sharon Pratt, and with me is Karen Tramontano. Reverend Mark Thompson is away on assignment. Our topic today, the future of policing in America. We have an ideal expert, Professor Elizabeth Hinton. Professor Hinton is an associate professor of history and African American studies at Yale University, as well as a professor of law at Yale University. She has a recently published book, America on Fire. What a joy it is to have you with us, Professor.
The pleasure is all mine. Thank you for having me.
So tell us about your book, America on Fire.
So this book really looks at a piece of history that I think has been really obscured, but is more relevant than ever today. It looks at what have been called riots, but what the people who participated in this form of political violence, and I view as political rebellion, what we need to view as political rebellion. This was the most widely adopted form of protests by young Black people in the aftermath of Martin Luther King's assassination. And basically in the late 1960s to early 70s was almost always in the response to the policing of ordinary and everyday activity. This history really helps us reckon with where we are and how we got to the crisis of policing today.
So where did policing begin in America? Was it a organized effort? Where did it begin and for what purpose?
You know, from the moment that the European colonists set foot in the United States, there's always been bodies to police both the indigenous populations, who of course this was their land, and then later, once the slave system began to emerge in the 17th century, enslaved populations. So, you know, what was known as the Indian constables in many settlements in New England, especially, were responsible for limiting the movement and mobility of Native peoples. And then during the antebellum period, as slavery continues to develop, what we begin to see are slave patrols, which essentially gave any white person in the southern states legal authority over enslaved Africans. And these essentially law enforcement bodies were responsible for dispersing of slave gatherings, searching slave dwellings for contraband, which of course meant books, meant reading materials, since it was illegal for enslaved Africans to learn how to read, and guns, because of course slave owners feared large-scale insurrection or rebellions on the part of enslaved populations, also of enslaved people to be able to leave plantations. And so this really informed the kind of fundamental logics of American policing, that is the surveillance and social control of people of color. And we see, you know, this imperative, this public safety imperative that is rooted in a white supremacist framework, kind of guiding the development of policing throughout the 20th century. The purpose of policing in middle class and white communities is to protect property from outsiders, whereas the purpose of policing in low-income communities of color is to search for suspects and arrest them and put them in prison, remove them from the community. And of course, these different approaches to public safety in communities based on race and class has created vast racial disparities and inequalities in our criminal legal system.
So, Professor, tell us a little bit more about the Johnson administration and how it dealt with both policing and its war on poverty.
So what's really interesting about the Johnson administration is that on the one hand, you know, the policies of the Great Society mark this kind of what's considered the height of progressive social change in the United States, with the war on poverty and a new emphasis on combating racial discrimination in domestic policy. Of course, through the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Jim Crow was formally dismantled. This was, of course, a law that began to be considered during the Kennedy administration, but enacted under Johnson. And then the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which enfranchised millions of African Americans in the South who had been legally prevented the right to vote. At the same time, however, Johnson also called for a war on crime. Johnson also began the unprecedented investment into local law enforcement and the revitalization of court systems and prisons for the first time in American history. And so, it's a complicated legacy where on the one hand, you've got all of this racial progress going on, and on the other, there's a real repressive and regressive emergence in domestic policy that ultimately endured far beyond Johnson's war on poverty. I mean, this is the mid-1960s are the origins of the policies that led to the mass incarceration that we face in the United States today.
So do you think there's a direct relationship between an expansion of rights for Black, in this case, largely Black Americans, but Black and Brown communities, and in institutional investment in police and police violence?
The prominent historical patterns in U.S. history is that every time the bounds of citizenship and rights expand for previously marginalized or excluded groups of Americans, and Black Americans in particular, we get a new racial regime that's based in new criminal laws and the expansion of the prison system. So immediately after the Civil War, the Southern states began to enact what's known as the Black Codes that targeted and criminalized the activities of newly freed people, and led to eventually the widespread arrests of African Americans, especially in the Southern states. They were quickly ensnared in a penal labor regime known as the convict lease system. And this was kind of the first mass incarceration in US society. You flash forward exactly 100 years later, in 1965, Johnson is supporting all of this monumental civil rights legislation. But in March 1965, at the same time that the Voting Rights Act is being sent to Congress, Johnson declares the war on crime and begins this unprecedented federal investment in local law enforcement for the first time in US history. Johnson led the federal government in expanding urban police forces in targeted communities of color, and in militarizing those forces with surplus weapons and technologies from Vietnam and U.S. interventions in the Caribbean and Latin America.
Well, I'm glad we're going to get the benefit of your thinking after this break. So don't go away. There's more of Professor Hinton on State of Play. Welcome back to State of Play. As you know, we're talking about the future of policing, and we're discussing it with Professor Elizabeth Hinton. Professor Hinton, is there an underlying thesis to your great work, America on Fire, that America wants to expand opportunity for all Americans, but not really? Because that's when you're seemingly suggesting that's when aggressive policing kicks in, or did I misread it?
Well, I think rather than contend with the underlying socioeconomic causes of violence in our communities, whether that's inter-community violence or whether that's the political violence of rebellion, and civil rights, racial justice protests. I mean, this is really about civil rights movement, as well as the Black rebellions of the 1960s, were about full political and economic inclusion in American society. They were about robust job programs in Black communities with high rates of unemployment, double that of white Americans, for a robust educational system, vibrant public schools, and a complete overhaul of public housing, as well as, of course, protection against both police brutality and white supremacist terrorism. I mean, these were the goals of the civil rights movement and also the goals of rebellion. And instead of making those sets of investments in communities, in the aftermath of the civil rights movement, the investment has been in police and in surveillance and in incarceration as a way to manage the material effects of poverty and racial inequality as they appear through crime and violence. And one of the things that my work shows is that this strategy has not kept our most vulnerable communities safe. This has been one of the biggest domestic policy failures. And now we've been brought to this crossroads, I think, underscored by the protests of 2020. And it's time for a different set of domestic priorities. It's time for a different set of investments that we know are cost effective. For instance, programs like Head Start, early childhood education, and job training programs, we know that these kinds of investments directly lead to a decrease in arrests and incarceration and worst case scenario, either shooting someone else or getting shot later in life. And these investments are cost effective, they're more humane, they lead to a more vibrant democracy. And yet, consistently, it's locking young people up. It's expanding police surveillance that ends up getting embraced. And so, I think now is really the time to think of a different set of investments beyond police reform. And these alternatives have been stressed for years. They've just been unheard. We can only imagine if that investment was made, if that job creation program for low-income Americans had been embraced by policymakers instead of the job creation program for police that was the war on crime, where we'd be as a society today. And if Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and countless others would still be with us.
What role has white supremacy and white vigilantism played?
Well, we see again and again that protests for racial justice throughout our history are consistently criminalized, and white supremacist violence either has been endorsed or looked the other way on the part of law enforcement officials and institutions. And we need to begin to take seriously ways to keep our communities safe and to decriminalize protests for racial justice. I mean, it's not just rebellions that were met with police. It was also, of course, the nonviolent direct action protests of Martin Luther King. And we saw this again in the most recent protests.
Professor Hinton, you have been terrific. Your insights have been wonderful. We can't thank you enough for enriching our audience, enriching all of us here as we talk about the future of policing on State of Play.
Thank you for having me. This was a great conversation.
Welcome back to State of Play. As you know, our topic today is community policing, whether there's a way it could ever work. Well, to help us understand that, we have one of America's leading experts on it. We have Dr. Lorenzo Boyd. He is the diversity officer and the vice president of diversity at the University of New Haven. He also spent 14 years in the sheriff's department in Suffolk County. Even when he came to the University of New Haven, he established a center for advanced policing. We're very lucky to have you. Thank you for being here, Dr. Boyd.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you for having me.
So, we know we have a troubled situation now. Has there ever been a good relationship with the community and the police in America?
I think overwhelmingly there has been negative relationships between the police and communities of color since Black and brown people were first brought to this country 400 years ago. When we go through levels of enslavement, and remember, the roots of policing in this country are often found in slave patrols. And we first saw that 1704 in South Carolina, where white men with long guns on horses would ride around the South looking for Black people that were not on plantations. They would find them, they would beat them, and sometimes sell them back into slavery and keep the proceeds. And you go from there, you move towards the Black codes or Jim Crow, or the civil rights struggle, segregation, stop and frisk, racial profiling. It goes on and on and on. The problem is there's always been a negative relationship between the police and communities of color, and it's the problem that the system itself is broken.
It seems to be sort of exploding now. I mean, are you concerned about the tensions in the community with police, and what are the implications if one can't address that?
I'm absolutely concerned because we see that the negative relationship keeps increasing. Every time we look, and it's not just about George Floyd or not just about Rayshard Brooks or not just about Breonna Taylor. We can go on and on and on and on and keep seeing at every point in history that there is an unarmed person of color being killed by the police. And a lot of people in the community see that, and they're experiencing vicarious trauma. Community members are traumatized by this, so it's not likely that they're going to want to easily work with the police. A lot of people in the community are also facing racial battle fatigue. They're tired. They're tired of saying the same stuff over and over and over again. And the onus is on the police to start doing something. But we can't have just the police do it. We need legislative intervention because we've let the police do what they do for the last 100 years or so, and it hasn't gotten any better. So legislative intervention is going to be something that's sorely needed.
So are you suggesting, like, such as Black Lives Matter, that we should defund the police, or do you think that doesn't work?
Well, first, let's take a look at the Black Lives Matter movement. And I do between 250 and 300 hours of training of police officers. And one of the things I tell them, Black Lives Matter is not at all anti-police. They're pro-accountability. Because statistically, if a Black person is killed in this country, their killer is less likely to be brought to justice, whether it's a cab driver, a dentist, or an Uber driver, or the police. Whoever it is needs to be held accountable. And the Black Lives Matter movement is about pro-accountability, first of all. And when we talk about defunding the police, the problem is when you start defunding the police, the first thing you lose is the training budget. We need to retrain the police to get them back into the community to do more community intervention. According to the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the budget for police, between 80 and 90% of that budget is personnel, payroll, and benefits. And of that 80 to 90%, 20% of that is overtime. So the defund movement is actually talking about resource reallocation. It's the same song and dance that every police chief and every mayor does this time of year, trying to decide where the money is going. So the fix is taking part of that 20% that you use in overtime and reallocate that into the reason that you need overtime. Move that money into preventative things in the community, because we know a significant number of people that are convicted of crimes in this country have a history of substance and alcohol abuse. So if we can deal with treatment instead of incarceration, I think that's a really good pathway forward.
Well, Dr. Boyd, who gets recruited to the police department? And are they individuals who have the experience or the training to make this segue into sort of preventative work?
You know, that's not the case. And right now, people going into policing, the numbers are dwindling. I talk to police chiefs every single day. And in the conversation, they also tell me they want to diversify. Well, let's acknowledge, to be a police officer in this country, you have to have reached 21 years of age and have a GED. We also acknowledge that the average adult brain doesn't fully develop until age 25 or 26, but yet we give 21-year-olds a gun and a badge and allow them to make life or death decisions. If we can push the age up to 25, but again, we're going to lose people, because at that point, people that are older, people that have better education, they tend to be able to get jobs that are better suited for them. So it's a slippery slope for the recruitment of police.
So do you think social workers need to be out there with the police? I mean, where are we going here?
Social work, I think, is a great answer to part of the problem that we're having. There are a lot of police departments across the country that are now starting to employ social workers, because many of the calls that the police get brought to, you don't need somebody with a gun and arrest power. Most of the time when people call the police, it's because it's situations out of their control, but it's not necessarily a crime. So if you can get police officers and social workers writing together, and on some of these calls have the social worker take the lead and the police officer stand in the back, I think that's a good pathway forward. Indianapolis is trying something like that. There are police departments around the country that are starting to bring in social workers, or at least have social workers on call to handle some of these non-criminal offenses. Because remember, crime is not the problem. Crime is symptomatic of larger problems in society. And if we fix the societal problems, the crime rate kind of takes care of itself.
How do you get America? How do you get communities in Suffolk, or in New Haven to buy into that kind of investment. Most people want a quick fix. They want somebody to come and help them right now, and they see that as somebody with a gun.
Well, it's funny that this problem with the police isn't the problem that happened post George Floyd. This is a problem that's been going on for a really long time. So unfortunately, there is no panacea. There is no quick fix. We're going from none to some, and then from some to more. The more we can engage with the community, the easier it's going to be. It's really easy to say, I hate the police, if you treat the police as a monolithic group. But once you get to know individual officers, it's really hard to say, I hate a specific officer that I have a relationship with. So if we can get police officers out of the cars into the community, because when the police use force, ultimately the line is, I feared for my life. Why is it that the police are more in fear in communities of color? Because they don't spend time in these communities. They don't know the community members. The more we can get people, police officers, into the community in non-enforcement ways, the better it's going to be for everybody.
Why do you care so much about this? I mean, you seem to have such a passion for it. What is your motivation, inner motivation in this space?
Well, growing up, I never had really positive views of the police. There was no officer friendly in my community. So when we saw the police dealing with people, I saw what was happening wrong. And my thought was, maybe I can get in there and be the change that I wanted to see. But the flip side is, when I was in uniform, whether I was at the courthouse or in the jail or on the street, I understood that the people that I'm seeing every day, when I'm out of uniform, I'm going to see these same people at the grocery store, at the drugstore, or at church. So I learned how to treat people with dignity and respect. If we can increase levels of empathy and compassion in policing and have them treat community members as though they were actual community members and not suspects, then we start to build these bridges.
Well, you certainly have given us reason to be more encouraged that this is an issue that can be addressed in a positive way. It's going to take a lot of effort to get people on board and to buy into it. But if anybody can get us there, I think you're the one who can do that, Dr. Boyd. So we're very, very grateful for all that you're doing, for your wonderful insights, and thank you so much for being on State of Play.
Thank you very much, Madam Mayor. It's my pleasure to be here with you.
Welcome back to State of Play. I'm Sharon Pratt, and with me is Karen Tramontano. Our topic today is the future of policing. We have with us now an expert, someone who's already a subject matter expert, DeAnza Cook. She is a Ph.D. Candidate and a presidential scholar at Harvard University, and the focus of her dissertation is community-oriented policing and problem-oriented policing. What a delight to have you with us.
It's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
So what works, DeAnza Cook? I mean, does community-oriented policing work? Problems-oriented policing work? What works?
When folks ask me what works in policing, I tell them that people do. In fact, police reforms, time and time again, have always been the product of power struggles between people inside police departments as well as outside of them. The policing institutions and the modern forces that we recognize today were in and of themselves products of reforms. People demanded to have police departments in certain cities where they were dominating political control. And these institutions were codified by law from the local all the way to the national government. And so this growth of policing and the repeated histories of recurrent police reforms are all motivated by people who work in the law enforcement fields as well as outside of them, folks who firsthand deal with some of the persistent problems in policing, such as police brutality and police murder, and have been since the inception of law enforcement.
So the findings of the Kerner Commission that President Johnson launched, did anybody in America implement those findings? And if they did they benefit anyone?
Unfortunately, despite his creation and call to action, President Johnson himself was displeased with the results that boldly proclaimed to the American people that we were indeed still living in a separate and unequal Black and white society, even in the wake of major legislative landmark achievements in the courts and in our national government for civil rights. In 1968, we were nowhere near finishing any of the movements that the Black freedom struggle, which began decades before then. And so when you have something like the Kerner Commission come out, of course, it immediately draws the attention of grassroots activists, civil rights and later Black Power activists who are already mobilizing in their communities to meet immediate needs for food security, housing, education, and welfare, et cetera. But the federal government makes the strategic decision to enact executive agencies that are explicitly dedicated to not community control or civilian review or kind of community grounded police reforms, but police research and development, scientific studies and observations of police patrol work and police administrative operations. The federal government, as well as nonprofit industries and foundations that become clearinghouses for police research, they decide to work within the insular confines of the academy and various state governments to fund these sorts of projects where they're working on the ground to figure out, does arrest work? Does foot patrol work? Because crime and disorder politics were running rampant at the same time that the federal war on crime is kicking off, and later the local drug and gang wars that unfortunately make America the largest incarcerator in the world by the end of the 20th century.
So can you give us examples of where it really has worked? You spoke of a lot of factors have to play in. Give us an example of where, alternative policing practices is being effective.
We're still learning so much about community policing, its history, and what classifies as community policing models that work. There is so much left to be learned about the history of Black law enforcement officers and their role in making community policing not just a specific model or strategy, but a philosophy and a concept for not just police work on the streets, but also police leadership and the way that police departments themselves were organized. It really starts with the police officers on the beat, the men and women who are desegregating and integrating police departments in the 1970s and 80s, who are already doing some of this work naturally. It's just now becoming, it was given a name and becoming a part of police academic conversations. And then, of course, with the 1994 crime bill and the creation of the COPS office, community policing becomes this overarching buzzword to encompass a variety of different strategies that the federal government is throwing money at in the 1990s. And so the criterion for community policing working was very different depending on who you were asking. In the wake of our most recent uprisings, grassroots activists and community leaders are demanding an entirely different approach and rethinking of not just community policing, but policing itself. We are in a stage where folks are trying to grapple with policing alternatives and policing models that go beyond just integrating the community in certain aspects of police work, but fundamentally rethinking policing alongside the community. And that is a much more rigorous and transformative, I would say, process.
Well, people have been decrying police brutality in the Black community since I can remember, and I'm a grandmother now. I mean, what makes you think enough, so much so that you are doing a dissertation in this space, that paradigm can change to the advantage of communities and the country?
We have tried for so many years in our history to just integrate select community members into policing conversations when it's expedient or when some crisis happens that calls for it. And I think the history of police reform and the history of community policing in particular shows us that we have to build an entirely new table where community voices can be heard in a way that's unprecedented. Police reform itself, as I said initially, has been a power struggle since the inception of police. And right now, the struggle is demanding new attendees and new thinkers and new leaders for an entirely different version of policing that we have yet to see. And so that reimagining necessitates not just telling community members to join in on conversations that are traditionally led by people in power, but actually listening and engaging with community leaders on a level playing field. That means giving folks equal planning power, equal budgetary power, and really delving into a historically informed understanding of policing that addresses the harms and addresses the needs for healing in our community that have too long now been neglected.
Well, you are certainly insightful. You bring us a lot of depth and breadth around a very critical issue. And thank you so very much for what you do and being on State of Play.
Thank you so much.
Welcome back to State of Play. As you know, today we're trying to figure out what is the future for policing in America. We have someone who's really thought about it, and he is very much a respected thought leader, especially around racial equity issues, Dr. Rashawn Ray. He's the David Rubenstein Fellow in Governance Studies at the Brookings Institution and a professor of sociology, I believe, at the University of Maryland, College Park. What an honor to have you with us.
Well, Mayor, it is great to be on with you, and I look forward to this important conversation.
So, Dr. Ray, what is the future of policing in this country? I mean, many people think it's a very broken system. Do you feel that there's a future for the system in America?
Well, I think it's a future if we get it right in this moment right now, or else I think things will continue as it has for not only the past, say, 50 to 60 years, but even the century before that. We have to think about it, that out of slavery, out of Jim Crow, out of civil rights, there is one institution that has largely not changed, and that has been law enforcement. The people have more or less shifted and been able to go from one period to the other as if we didn't need to replace them or even replace the policies that were in place. So I think that there is a pathway toward racial equity, but we have to get it right. And part of getting it right is holding police officers who are these so-called bad apples accountable, and then holding accountable the police departments and the structure and the culture that they actually come from.
This system is so entrenched. So who do you turn to change things? Is it the federal government? Is it the state government? I mean, where do you turn?
I think it's all of the above. And so one of the things that I've done over the past decade is taking a deep dive into policing, police culture, police training. Our virtual reality training program at the University of Maryland, we trained thousands of police officers. And I could tell you, one of the things I realized at the end of a large training that we had is that we were working with the wrong constituents. Oftentimes we focus on law enforcement, not realizing that they don't mandate policy and law. What they do is oftentimes they implement policy and law. And if we really want to change it, then we have to focus on the federal lawmakers, the state lawmakers, and the local lawmakers, but particularly at the state and federal level. I think part of this starts with the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act that currently sits in the Senate. The House of Representatives has passed it twice. The three things that are key for that legislation: first, abolishing qualified immunity. That is central. One thing we know is that over the past 5 years, if we only look at the major 20 metro areas around the United States, over $2 billion with the B has been spent out in civilian payouts for police misconduct that has completely absolved law enforcement because of qualified immunity. That's something that needs to change. We know that New York City and then the states, including Colorado and New Mexico, have done something about that. The state of Maryland is, I think, aiming to do something about that. They had the Maryland Police Accountability Act that has went pretty far in terms of repealing the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights. But then the two other things that are central deal with data. We know how many people get killed by jellyfish every year. The CDC collects it. but we don't know how many people get killed by law enforcement. I think that's a travesty. And regardless if you're on the right or the left, people should feel that way. So we need to have these federal databases that Republicans and Democrats largely agree on. Not only a bad apples database so that they can't cross state lines or be like Timothy Loman trying to get hired at his fourth department. Timothy Loman was the officer who killed 12-year-old Tamir Rice while he played with a toy gun with his sister in a park in Cleveland. But then also we need a use of force database so that we can properly collect information to not only figure out when use of force is most likely to occur, but also when it's not most likely to occur. And I think that's central moving forward.
Qualified immunity, just what is qualified immunity?
So qualified immunity is a court's doctrine that alleviates police officers and other government officials from facing any sort of financial liability. So for example, that $27 million that George Floyd's family got, that $12 million that Breonna Taylor's family got, that $20 million that William Green's family got, those monies largely come from taxpayers. And then we go to cities like Chicago. They don't even have enough money in their budget to pay it. So after they finished appropriating money, they take out what are called police brutality bonds. This money largely falls on taxpayers, including Black and brown communities that are overly policed. Part of what people are saying with addressing qualified immunity is that now police officers and police departments take some of that financial burden, if not all of it. And one of the main recommendations that I've had, along with some of my colleagues, is creating police department insurance policies and police officer liability insurance so that the officers don't just come out of pocket to try to pay for things that they don't have the money for, but that insurance covers it. And then those insurance companies become another form of accountability, because as people know when they drive a car all the time, if you have enough accidents, then all of a sudden the insurance company is going to say you are no longer insurable. That has happened to some police officers in smaller municipalities, and we need it to become the norm instead of the exception.
Is that something you think can be done on a fast basis, or quick term basis?
I think so. So the state of Colorado and Denver has moved forward with this. They did a lot of this work in 2020. I think they become the exemplar. So first, they abolished qualified immunity at the state level. Okay, then they had to figure out, okay, since that's the case, what's going to happen now? Well, what they did was they put in a plan for police departments to have insurance policies, and then officers to pay these civilian payouts for police misconduct up to $25,000, either out of pocket or with the insurance policy, which is what most officers are doing. They are now getting a malpractice insurance policy to cover themselves. And so not only is it going to be the city or the municipality or even the state making decisions on whether or not officers should be decertified, but then the insurance company is going to play a role in this. We've seen this in other places around the country, like in East Tennessee, in Inkster, Michigan, and places outside of LA, where small municipalities have had insurance risk pools. And because of those insurance risk pools, when a settlement is so large, the insurance company has said, we can no longer insure your officers, or like in the case of a department outside of LA, they said we can no longer afford to insure your department. And that bad department was closed. And all of a sudden, we started having more equitable outcomes because of it.
And I won't belabor this point, but can police officers really afford this? We already see they're under great pressure, a high incidence of suicide. I mean, how do we handle this?
Well, look, without a doubt, I think policing is probably the most difficult job we have in America. And you just noted that there's a study that I've been able to analyze some data on showing that about 80% of police officers suffer from chronic stress, depression, anxiety, marital problems, anger issues. And then you have about a sixth of them who are suicidal or who report substance abuse problems because of the things they see and experience on a daily basis. Here goes the kicker. 90% of them never seek help. So one of the other recommendations that we have in our Brookings report, along with the American Enterprise Institute and Cato, is that we're recommending that officers get mandatory psychological counseling. We are also mandating that they get incentives to live in the neighborhoods where they actually police. Because see, this is one of the things. a majority of white officers do not live in or close to the neighborhoods that they are policing in. They don't experience those communities. They don't know those communities. But Black and Latino officers do. But I do think that there need to be incentives. As you know, trying to live in Washington, D.C. is extremely expensive. So there have to be certain incentives set up. But when it comes to mental health, that is a big problem. But this goes back to thinking about insurance. This is not for officers to have to pay out of pocket. They don't make enough money to pay $1 million in settlements. That would just be frivolous and irresponsible, not only to the victim's family, but then also the assailant in these cases. But this is what insurance is for.
Can you name, because we're running out of time, a couple of other initiatives that might really make a difference?
Yeah, I think some of the other things that'll make a difference at the local level, we need to have community oversight boards. The state of Maryland has mandated this. I think the example here is the city of Nashville, where the oversight board literally has votes on the internal police misconduct board. I think that is central for what's going on. And then also we need to think about shifting or reallocating calls for service when it comes to traffic calls, when it comes to mental health. Denver is a really good example there.
Well, you have at least some areas to really zero in on, particularly qualified immunity, almost like medical malpractice insurance. It's fascinating, and we really appreciate it. And thank you so much, Dr. Ray, for being here with us on State of Play.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome back to State of Play. I'm Sharon Pratt, with me, Karen Tramontano. Our topic today, the future of policing. So it's been good, has it not? I mean, the conversations, we've had historians, DeAnza Cook, Dr. Elizabeth Hinton, but we also had Rashawn Ray as well as Lorenzo Boyd. Lorenzo Boyd explained how community policing can work. Rashawn Ray always creates sort of a philosophical and practical context for the conversation. And I think everybody came to understand that it had a very challenging beginning and its original purpose. So it helps us in terms of future conversations about the future of policing in this country. It helps us when we examine defund the police.
Mayor, this has been one of the most informative programs that I've been a part of, but it's also been one of the most depressing. When we hear the historical overview from Professor Hinton, it is so clear that so little has changed. When we listen to, what is needed for police reform, it just seems such a daunting task. And I just don't see the political will to make it happen, certainly not at the federal level. And it just gives me great cause for concern, because we need to get out of the cycle or the spiral that we are in. And I do have faith that local leaders and some of the local leaders that we have interviewed know what needs to be done and is serious about reforming. We also need legal reforms, clearly. And without the financial accountability, I don't see how anything changes, because clearly police departments are far willing to have cities and states pay enormous fees to families where their sons and daughters have been murdered than they are to change. And that is very, very troubling.
I'm glad that we did have this conversation here on State of Play about the future of policing in America. And I'm glad that we got to do a deeper dive, because I'd say all of our speakers and guests really push community policing. They really see the urgency of community policing. But once you have a historical context, particularly Dr. Hinton, you understand why once there was professional policing in this country, it was really designed to patrol slaves, as well as other sort of new immigrant types who came to America. And so you understand better why there's pushback in the police department. They may want to do it, but it institutionally was anchored in having that kind of mission. So maybe defund the police is the way to go, you know, start anew. I'm not sure, but it has been, for me at least, a rich conversation. As a former mayor, I had a hard time always understanding defund police, but now I get it, given the history of this institution. And I hope all of you have enjoyed and been enriched and enlightened by it. And so join us again next week. And thank you for being with us today on State of Play.